Everybody, welcome to today's Substack Live. I'm Dave Keating from Gulfstream Blues, and I'm joined today by Julien Hoez from the French Dispatch. We're doing another of our takes on the week to wrap up what was a very eventful, very busy week. Julien, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me, really. It's always fun to have these nice chats every once in a while and catch up.
Yeah, and certainly no shortage of things to talk about for sure. We figured we'd start out. There's basically three things. Well, I'll let you know up at the top. There's three things we want to talk about here. The news from last night about the new Pope, the meeting between President Macron and Chancellor Merz in Paris on Wednesday, the meeting with Donald Tusk in Poland, and basically the general developments with Friedrich Merz this week, which have been a little alarming to people in the EU bubble. And then finally, third, we're going to talk about this push to get academics away from the US since they're facing censorship there, hostility, and trying to attract them over to Europe. So let's start with the big topic last night, the announcement of a new pope. An American pope. People are really shocked by that. I was really shocked by that. So I was in Rome earlier this week, talking to people, like mulling around Vatican City, the part of it that you can go into, just the St. Peter's Square, basically, and talking to people about what they expect. And I ran into a couple Americans. You only have to shake a stick in Rome, and you're going to hit an American. And every one of them said the same thing. There's no way there will be an American pope. Everyone seemed really sure of that. And then there was. So when the announcement came, I was thinking, okay, this isn't happening in a vacuum. There's a reason they made this choice. But what's the reason? And then the more I learned about this guy, the more I thought, I think I see some reasoning here. But I don't know, Julian, what was your reaction when you got this news last night?
So, I mean, firstly, congratulations. It's pretty impressive that it's an American this time, because there's always been this idea. It's a bit like having a French head of NATO. It's assumed that it's never, ever going to happen, right? So, firstly, congratulations. But I found it quite interesting because you have a pope now who has a firstly, is a continuation of the previous pope's papal line, if you can call it that. So he has a lot of the same proclivities, he has a lot of the same attitudes, he has a bit of the same globalist, multilateral view of how Catholicism should exist in the modern world. But the really interesting part, and the part that's actually made this so much funnier than it usually is when a new pope is elected, is that he has consistently been criticizing Donald Trump's agenda. I mean, whether you're talking about migrants, whether you're talking about refugees, whether you're talking about the need to support people who are impoverished in the world, or the need for, financial stability and, prosperity in general. This, the former Cardinal Robert Prevost, who is now Pope Leo XIV, I believe, he's the complete opposite of the MAGA movement, which is why a lot of people have seen that they have been completely losing their minds over on social media. I think I saw someone, I think it may have been Marjorie Taylor Greene, but don't quote me on this, called him the Antichrist or something. It was absolutely insane.
I think she said the same thing about Pope Francis as well.
Probably, yeah. But no, it's quite impressive, because I think geopolitically it's interesting, because people forget that the Papal States technically still a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Vatican technically acts in its own little state-like way, which means that you now have another bulwark against this weird far-right wave coming across in the messaging they put forward. Because I think a lot of people missed out on the fact that the far-right in America were actively trying to influence this election towards one of the more conservative cardinals, and trying to influence it in their sense of, Christian political ideology.
Yeah, it was interesting. When the announcement came, I couldn't remember the name of that. I think it's the New York Archbishop, who is very conservative and MAGA aligned. And so when they first said, oh, and it's an American, I thought, oh, no. My first reaction was the Vatican's gone MAGA. But then, so I quickly Googled Robert Prevost and was reassured. And so I wonder if they I think there's a risk of reading too much politics into the cardinal's decision, which is actually a decision about the leader of the church, and it's a spiritual decision. It's
Yeah.
about the internal workings of the church first and foremost. But they don't exist in a vacuum, and politics obviously plays a role inside the Sistine Chapel when they're making this decision. So I wonder if they chose a kind of resistance American Pope purposefully as somebody who can, obviously the US president has the bully pulpit, has so much power and gravitas when he speaks, but so does the Pope. And so maybe they saw Robert Prevost as a potential counterbalance to Trump's messaging, to Trump's hostility. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
It's just as likely that this actually played no role and they just thought he was the best person for the role. One thing that I've heard said about him is that he shares a lot of the same reforming instincts as Pope Francis, but he's a more agreeable person, that people like him. And Pope Francis, especially I think within the Vatican, as I've read, really rubbed people the wrong way. He could be quite harsh. He could be quite strident. And so that maybe they chose Prevost as somebody who could deliver the same message, take the church in the same direction, but win over more hearts and minds. Have you heard the same?
Yeah, so I mean, there's always this point where, to be honest, we know that nothing exists in a vacuum. Politics plays a role in everything. And I think that, to be entirely honest, despite the fact that there are ideological fractures in the church, as far as we understand it, because of course they're not necessarily going to have these disagreements in public, the reality is electing someone like Prevost, who is more on the centrist side of things, more progressive in his views, has very much we can call it a positive view of religion and the way religion can be used. And the fact that the cardinals didn't choose a traditionalist who typically want to focus mostly on Western Catholicism and Western Christianity, and they've gone for someone who is more open to actually reaching out to places in the world where Catholicism and Christianity aren't necessarily as well aligned, does send a message of openness and very much a global, entre guillemets, a globalist view. But again, there are always these views within the church that while they are quote unquote liberal or progressive, they still have these very odd positions, or odd to us as people who are more progressive, or the modern world. So for example, as the reader just mentioned, he is pro-life, to be honest. I believe there are still some points on the role of women in the church. I mean, similar to Pope Francis, who also had these positions where he wasn't necessarily ready to open every aspect of the Vatican to women, as far as I remember. And again, there are still some ways that, he's probably more agreeable purely because of the fact that there are so many fractures in the church. And this will have been why he was chosen, because Pope Francis sometimes picked fights with the traditionalists, and sometimes he picked fights with the more pro-liberal or the more liberal cardinals, because he didn't want to give too much away, because he thought it would sap the influence or the position of the church. But it's a bit of a double-edged sword, and it's interesting to see how people are reading into the politics of this, because there are so many papacy experts, but this kind of, let's say, choice does show that the church is taking a position that is the antithesis of what we're seeing in a lot of far-right religious movements.
Yeah, it's interesting. When the news first came, my first reaction was, oh, this is probably the first pope from a majority Protestant country. And then I remembered, no, Germany is a majority Protestant country. And so Ratzinger would have been, Benedict would have, maybe he was the first, I'm not sure. But I think the situation's a bit different in Germany and the US, because while Germany, I believe, is numerically majority Protestant, it is largely secular. I mean, I think that the proportion of non-believers in Germany is quite high. And also it's a multi-confessional state. Obviously, the conflicts between Protestants and Catholics in what is today Germany has a long and bloody history. But in the modern world, even in the Nazi times, this was not really a major division. Whereas I grew up Catholic in the United States, and Catholics in the US really have a tendency to talk about themselves like they're a persecuted minority. I think that's a bit of a stretch.
Yeah.
But there's only ever been two Catholic presidents in the U.S. One we just had with Joe Biden, the earlier one JFK. When JFK became president, he had to swear that he would not take orders from the Pope. So really, you don't have to go back too far, where Catholics were seen as kind of a discriminated against minority. And in certain areas of the U.S., like down south, there's not many Catholics. I'm from the New York City area, where there's lots and lots of Catholics, obviously. But down south, I think when you talk to people who grew up Catholic in the South, they say they really feel like a minority. So I think that's interesting. I do think that you could say that the US is more of a Protestant majority country than Germany, also because the US is so much more religious than Germany,
Yeah.
and because religion plays such a huge role in public life in the US, in which it does not in Germany. So I wonder how that might impact things. And I also wonder how much that factored into the choice. Coming from France, a completely Catholic country, but also very secular country like Germany, how do you think the reaction has been to this in France, that there's an American Pope, let's say, rather than a French Pope? We know that France and the US have rivalries in many areas with things like this.
I mean, I think, to be honest, it's because we are still a republic. And I mean, I'm sharing my opinions on this as a Republican, to be fair, even if I'm a baptized Catholic. I think the position has, broadly speaking, been quite positive, where people are, honestly, in my view, more happy that the status quo has continued, where it's still a relatively middle-of-the-road pope, to be honest. Of course, you're always going to get the far right actors who are saying, we've got a woke pope. How dare they choose someone who's not really a Catholic? Despite the fact that he's the fucking pope. But it's a weird one because it's still a minority, and to be honest, most people, they're happy that it's happened. It's interesting to see this kind of history happen because I still remember when the last pope was elected when I was a child, and honestly, it's it's been received in a fairly positive way. It's been received a little better than the Merz shenanigans that we're going to get into in a second, but it's been quite positive, aside from the far right being far right and saying far right things and tantrums.
Yeah, let's talk about that Merz visit. So, speaking of these two secular countries, the Franco-German motor at the center of Europe. So we had quite a scare for Europe earlier this week when Friedrich Merz failed to be elected chancellor on the first ballot. That shocked people. That's never happened in the history of Germany. It's a secret ballot, so it's not clear where the defections came from. I believe he was 18 votes short. No, he was 6 votes short of what he needed. Yeah. But there were clearly 16 or 18 MPs from his coalition that voted against him. Now, his coalition is the center-left SPD and the center-right CDU-CSU. Most likely, the defections came either from the left wing of the SPD, who were mad at Merz for previous flirtations with the far-right AfD, or it came from the right wing of the CDU-CSU more likely there, who were mad at Merz for not immediately moving forward with campaign pledges that put the center right toward the far right on migration and on these types of issues. So maybe first on that, which do you think it was? Who do you think defected, the left wing or the right wing?
I think it was both, to be honest. I think it's very much because the thing that people forget, and lots of people don't watch politics as close as we do, so they don't pay attention to the small things. But Merz is very abrasive. He's always been very abrasive. It's why his career kind of died in the early 2000s, right? When I believe he ran against Merkel early on, lost by such a margin, he went to become a hedge fund manager or something along those lines, right? And one of the big concerns that everybody had in last year's elections was, how would you counterbalance the fact that Merz is a bit too blunt for German society. Like Merz is the kind of person, for everybody's knowledge, where if he thinks that someone's doing something really dumb in a meeting, he will tell them they're doing something really dumb in that meeting.
It's
And
very German in that way.
yeah, but he takes it to a point where it's almost like borderline French,
Yeah,
where he
yeah, that's
like,
the thing. I mean, German people can be quite unpleasant and blunt, but he's different because they're
yeah,
still like polite and blunt, if I could put it like
yeah,
that. Whereas he's quite aggressive and blunt, and that's not very German, is it?
yeah, and he runs people over in meetings, which,
Yeah.
to be honest, is not the best way of being a leader of a country like Germany. But regardless of this, to be honest, it came from both sides. But I think the really interesting thing about the whole situation, because I don't think, I mean, I'm speaking for myself. I don't know if you agree with me on this, Dave, but I feel like people were expecting him to go through anyway, because they still had 14 days to make things happen after the
Mhm.
first vote went down, right?
So they wanted to send a message.
Yeah, and the really interesting thing for me is that when the heads of the factions met, as they do during these situations, not a single person knew what the procedure was. They had to call outside lawyers to explain to them what they were allowed to do, because even the people who had nuked the agreement and who had basically created a constitutional crisis of some sorts weren't actually aware of what they had done. And so people they had to wait a few hours to figure that out. And then they had to find a majority, which included Die Grüne and the Linke, so the far left, to actually allow another vote to happen, so that Merz could be run for a second vote on this and then be elected with, I think, a majority of 6 or along these lines. So the really crazy thing for me is that they were sending a message, or lots of people weren't doing this. But as I said on several occasions, the crazy thing is that they just haphazardly, to send a message, did a lot of damage to Germany's image. I mean,
Mm.
you have a chancellor who fails for the first time in the first vote in ever in this current republic. You had the Wedel from the AfD who was screaming from the rooftops, "He doesn't have a majority. We need another election." You had people who, quite frankly, just don't like Merz showboating and saying, "Ha, we took him down. Let's do it again." And then you have the leadership of the German parties who don't actually know the heads from the tails of what they're allowed to do,
Mm.
which is why everybody was so shocked, right?
Yeah, and I think you're right that people didn't really fully think about the repercussions of this. My experience living in Germany, living in Berlin for 3 years, is that Germany is a incredibly provincial country. The German mindset is incredibly provincial, and they never think about how what they're doing impacts their neighbors, impacts the world at large. What's the expression? Germany is a superpower pretending to be Switzerland.
Yeah.
They always want to pretend that though it's just little tiny Germany, ignore us, we don't mean anything to anyone. And this is why you get so much frustration from Germany's neighbors, that they take decisions without consulting their neighbors as if it makes no difference to them. For instance, when Angela Merkel shut down nuclear power in Germany without consulting any of Germany's neighbors who take in that nuclear power, that was an incredible mess. I mean, I could list 10 examples of this that Germany has done. The politicians there are incredibly parochial, and they don't think about the international implications of things like this. And this is the problem with Germany, right? Germany is it should be a leader in Europe, and it's not. And I think we saw the worst example of this under the Scholz government, which was just so inward looking, so flailing, so weak. And during the Scholz government, they really, here in Brussels, they were just absent. I mean, they became at best a nuisance, an irritation, but never leading, never providing really productive input here in Brussels. So people here in Brussels were really, really eager to see a new German chancellor. And when he came out in his very strident way after the election, talking about how Europe needs to be independent of the United States, and people were like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And now I was in Strasbourg yesterday and talking to people there, MEPs, and they were saying, it's done. We got our hopes up for nothing, because he is clearly going to be so distracted with managing these domestic rivalries, these little petty political rivalries in Berlin, that he won't have the time or the bandwidth or the political capital to be able to put Germany back on the world stage. Europe really needs Germany to be on the
Yeah.
world stage. So people were almost ashen faced about this that I
Oh
talked to.
yeah. And we're just seeing this, like even this morning, there were the reports of the fact that somebody in Merz's coalition pulled the trigger on their immigration brake too early. So they leaked the plan. And now they're having to run back on this and saying, oh no, we're not actually planning to do this quite yet. Where they're going to continue the suspension of Schengen and all this kind of thing, right? And like you just keep reading these things, and like a lot of us were really hopeful about this. Like we were like, oh wow, they've elected a German, almost a German Macron, right? Slightly more to the
Mm,
right, but they've got someone who actually wants to do this kind of serious politicking. But again, now we're looking at this weird, this instability in the coalition when we were hoping that it would be a bit more stable. The far wings on either party are doing ridiculous things, and it's looking like the instability is going to continue despite the fact that we have a smaller coalition. And
yeah,
not,
Germany continues to disappoint us. That's
yeah, and they're behaving the way people see France, which isn't a good thing, you know?
yeah. Well, speaking of France, so we had for his very first visit, Merz came to Paris yesterday to meet with no Wednesday, to meet with President Macron. How did that meeting go? How was it received in France?
So the meeting with Macron was received quite positively because I mean it's always this question that we always say that, you know, recently in the last couple of decades, we keep missing each other as countries. So for a while, you had a strong French leader, then you had Merkel, who had nothing but weak French leaders. Then you had Macron, Merkel, when Macron was the dynamic one, then Merkel was on the way out, and then you had Schultz, and it's this thing where we keep missing each other. And I think right now the view is that for the pro-Europeans, for the people who really want a strong defense at a European level, strong European independence, this was viewed as a good thing because you have two people who are singing from the same hymn sheet, right? There's coordination there. There's still some caution, of course, because there's always this question like when Macron was elected and we were saying, oh wow, Merkel has a strong, you know, interlocutor now in France. We were very quickly disappointed, right? We found ourselves like, oh, Merkel's just pulling the brakes on everything. Merkel doesn't really want to do much. But there's lots of positive signals, which is, you know, Merz agrees with Macron on the military. Merz agrees with Macron increasing spending. Merz agrees with Macron the need for Germany to become a strong military power again, because, you know, we need more of this, and we need the Weimar Triangle to become a lot more powerful and a lot more influential at the European level. But there's also some issues that exist, like the nuclear thing. We don't know if they're actually going to bring nuclear back in Germany. And there's always this fear that once this situation with Ukraine and Russia ends and a bit of time passes, it'll be business as usual with Germany, where people will start saying, oh, we should buy Russian gas again, you know? And there's going to be more dependence outside and less independence internally. There's also the question about whether this work on European champions can actually go forward because the industrial topics don't necessarily push as well as they can. And there's always this issue with the competitiveness at the EU level, which is a whole other chat we can have because this is one of the fun topics in Brussels right now. But all in all, there were positive feelings. There were very positive feelings. People are feeling optimistic, and people feel that there's a chance that something's going to go well, especially if von der Leyen keeps being stronger, if they reinforce Tusk in the upcoming elections in Poland, and if things keep going the way they're going with Trump basically being our best friend as European federalists and proving us right, you know?
Okay, so it sounds like there's more positivity in Paris than I was hearing in Strasbourg yesterday. Maybe everyone
Yeah.
was just in a bad mood yesterday. Maybe I was, so that was leading other people. So let's talk now about this academic issue. You had on French Dispatch an excellent piece about this. So we're seeing what's happening in the U.S. We have Trump trying to shut down Harvard. They're going after universities. Always bears repeating private universities. The US university system is different than Europe. The best universities are private. The not so good universities are the public ones. These are, in theory, supposed to be entirely separate from the government,
Yeah.
which was what makes them so expensive at $50,000 a year. Uh, the argument that's always been, I mean, the US higher education system is so messed up. that's a whole other topic for another live. But the defense that Americans always make of this as well in Europe, those are public universities, and so they're subject to state control. Here in the US, our universities are completely independent. Well, now we're seeing, well, maybe they're not, can the national government can suddenly basically shut your universities down by depriving them of funding, then they're not really independent. And we saw with Columbia University, they caved in immediately. They were not profiles in courage here. And actually, I have friends who went to Columbia. I went to NYU for college, so I had a lot of friends at Columbia, and they said not one more dollar to Columbia after this. So they'll never give the money again. So Columbia caved, but Harvard is not caving. But in the meantime, of course, the message that this is sending is that the U.S. regime is anti-academia, anti-research, and particularly for the foreign students and researchers that are in the U.S., they're now learning they can be kicked out at any moment for no reason. They could be arrested for no reason, simply for writing an op-ed that says everybody should respect different beliefs. They can be arrested. So obviously, the non-American people I know who are in the U.S. have all been talking to me. They want to leave. There are a lot of them that I'm talking to want to come back to Europe, but they're not exactly sure what they will do. And two people I know are researchers.
Yeah.
One in Chicago and one in New York. And they are European. I won't say the country, but they say that the problem is, the most advanced research institutes are in the U.S. And so they're working on very specific fields, and they're like, I want to get out of this country. I don't feel safe here, but I don't know where I can go without having to actually change my career, change my field of research. It's very difficult for them. So tell us a little bit about what your vision for how Europe can attract these researchers and academics here and start to rival the US in these areas that have been ceded to the US for so long.
Yeah, so I mean, this kind of situation is always complicated because I mean, we've seen that they don't care. Like they deported cancer researchers who were making breakthroughs in the field of treating cancers, right? Like it's absolutely bombastically ridiculous politics from the US. But I mean, really the biggest thing that the Europeans can do right now is actually create a more standardized model across the EU, right? Like they need to work on actually developing all of these structures that can actually bring the high level technology, bring the high level expertise of these actors towards us. And this includes, I mean, we're already a big research and development continent. We have a big scientific community, right? But the reality is that the budget's not there. Like the discussions after Macron said we should bring these researchers to France and Europe, the immediate reaction was we don't have enough money for this right now, which is why Ursula von der Leyen's announcement that they're going to be putting forward 500 million euros in funding between 25 and 27 to attract these researchers to us, to support their research here and to help their work in Europe. This is why Macron's contributing for France 100 million. So 1/5 of this program is coming from the French 2030 program, because we recognize that this is important, right? I mean, you can't, if we play this right and we use European soft power and even hard financial market power properly, we can make this work, because the issue is always funding. People don't come to Europe because the funding is an issue. I remember when I was looking at PhDs, and I was looking at PhDs here in Europe as well as in the US. The funding options in the US were far better than here in Europe, even for poli-sci, And it's one of these crazy things where we don't actually put enough money into the later stages of research and the structures around this academic environment, right? So now that the US is cutting federal research funding, cutting funding to universities like Columbia, or threatening to, for example, you've got conservatives who are apparently queuing up outside of these research institutes to say that they're doing Satan's work. It's absolutely fucking crazy nonsense. The fact that we're actually putting our money where our mouth is, and we're actually going to start developing structures that actually encourage people to come here and make money is great. But this also needs a stronger reinforcement of the Horizon program. This needs a stronger reinforcement of European capabilities. Because it's not even just a case of attracting these experts in the US. We need to make it work in our advantage and start building up the minds we have here as well, because there are so many experts. I mean, you and me know this, that we've crossed between us probably thousands of some of the brightest people we could imagine. who just didn't have the opportunities because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, didn't have the funding, didn't have the support, and didn't have the opportunities. And if we can bring these experts here, we can pay them, we can use them as teachers for Europeans, for example, and we can even use them as mentors to tell us to, and let's be honest, in some cases, we need Americans to tell us, how do we do what you were doing in the US? And how do we build the same structures here in Europe so we can make the most of your expertise? And if we do that, then we can really get there, right?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think the difficulty is, as you say, so many of the structures are not here for that, especially at European level. And the thing is, education is not a European competence. I think it should be. I think it could, within the existing treaties, you could make moves into this. And we now have a defense commissioner that's not supposed to be an EU competence.
Yeah.
We have a health commissioner that's not supposed to be an EU competence. We have a housing commissioner now in this new term, also not supposed to be an EU competence. Why not an education commissioner?
Exactly.
There's so much of and I've written about this a lot in the past. So much of the failure of the European project is an education failure. That students in the EU are not taught how the EU works. They are not taught basic civics about their federal level of government. And then we ask them to vote in these elections for a thing that they've never been told what it is.
Yeah.
The only messages they get are people criticizing it, media stories that are made up. And because they have no base of knowledge from education, then they don't know what to do. That's kind of a separate topic to this, which is more research and academia. But the problem is, if you have these national systems for education that are entirely national, all the EU can do is funding. So with Horizon, which is the research funding program for the EU, there's programs like Erasmus, which is a student exchange. And Erasmus has really developed over the years. Now there's Erasmus Plus, and it's moved into more, because originally it was more for like younger people, but now there's like adult education for Erasmus. But all of that is
and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. But all of that is funding. And I think here in Brussels, we need to think about moving beyond just funding, because that's not a plan. Funding is not a plan. Funding is just throwing money at different national initiatives and hoping it works out. If we had a plan at EU level to attract students, academics, researchers away from the United States or from around the world, basically not necessarily taking them if they're already in the US, you want that Indian researcher to come to Europe instead of the United States. And we know that with the situation right now, their first priority is the United States because it has the best research facilities. We need a European plan to figure out how we can do that in Europe, because the US has a US plan. Those types of plans are not state level in the US, they are federal. But that's going to possibly ruffle some feathers, because whenever you move into an area that is considered a national competence, especially with something as sensitive as education, because it has to do with crafting young people's minds, etc., you're going to get pushback. But Ursula von der Leyen gave this speech where she had this veiled criticism of Trump, the Trump regime, saying that it was folly for certain governments to be restricting academic research and chasing researchers away. But do you think she is ready to actually put her money where her mouth is here? Not just more funding for Horizon, but actually coming out and saying, you know what, we're going to take a bit of control over education. We're going to make this, like they did with health, like they did with defense, like they did with housing. We're going to, just by doing it, make this a European issue. Do you think she has the nerve to do that?
I mean, I think that she tries, and to be honest, it becomes easier when you have people like Merz, Macron, Tusk around the table who all understand the European dimension of all of this, right? I mean, a big part of it as well is that so they're putting forward I think it's the European Innovation Act and the Startup and Scale Up strategy, which we should probably actually delve into in a future topic. And I feel that this is going to become a regular sort of discussion between you and me, where we're going to start covering a lot of European stuff. But the reality is, I think she does, but the problem is she needs more support. And I wonder if this wouldn't change, because I can't remember when the next Italian elections are, but they're in like 2 or 3 years,
Not
right?
for a while, yeah.
And if you end up with so Orban's looking like he may lose the next elections, it's looking like Meloni. Well, I'm not sure if Meloni will lose the next elections, but there's, chances that things will happen. And if she has a unanimous group of leaders who are pro-European and who are willing to say, okay, we're willing to collaborate, at a minimum on education, then I think she could, if she pushed for it, she could get that. The problem is that the position of a European Education Commissioner, the issue with that is you basically have someone who has to coordinate with the member states because they're not going to be able to handle everything across all of the country and linguistic lines, right? I think this is one of the weaknesses of the European system is that you do have the different linguistic barriers. Not that it's a weakness because we get over it with the very strong translation and interpretation DG here in Brussels. But they would need, the role would basically be like the defense commissioner, where it would be a coordination role, where making proposals, negotiating this kind of things, it would, in the truest sense of the term of what the Council of the European Union does, it would basically be a chair of these ministers coming together and discussing things, which is still better than nothing.
But actually, what's interesting is that that's what the U.S. model is like, because education is a state competence in the U.S. Some people, obviously the Trump regime now believes that it should be completely a state competence, which is why they're getting rid of the Federal Department of Education. And I think actually when Europeans see that, they think like, oh my God, they're abolishing education in the U.S. That's not what's happening. It's that education, it's basically the thing we don't have here in the EU. So let's say we did have a DG education in the Commission and a European Commissioner for Education, and you had a new Eurosceptic Commission president, and they said, this is supposed to be a member state competence. This DG was set up unconstitutionally, and so I'm scrapping the Director General for Education, and there will be no Education Commissioner. That's what the Trump administration is doing, and they are right that education is a state competence. However, the way it's developed in the U.S. over the last 100 years is they plan things at federal level. So individual states still have a lot of room for huge room. I mean, they design their own curriculum. It's why we have two different exams in the U.S. Some people take the ACT, some people take the SAT. There's totally different education systems. There's different GPAs. Like I remember when I graduated high school, I had a GPA out of 4, but other states had out of 6, and it's a total mishmash. But the point is, and the reason why it's stupid that the Trump administration is getting rid of the Department of Education is that you still need to coordinate these things, and they have been. And that's what's made the U.S. the superpower for research, not just these private universities being so great and moving forward. There was a plan. There was a national plan. And that's all that we would be asking the commission to do here, is just make a plan to coordinate all the different state systems that would still be a member state competence. You're just guiding it. It would be weird if we started to establish this here in the EU at the same time that they're getting rid of the federal education competence in the US. I think we'll wrap it up there. Before we go, I thought maybe each of us could just talk about what we're going to be working on next week with our respective Substacks. And in the meantime, if anyone watching has a question, you can put it in quickly, and then if we have any, we'll get to them. So I'll go first. Next week is the Cannes Film Festival. And so at the start of that, I'm going to publish a Substack asking, what would Europeans do if Trump had threatened last week to put a 100% tariff on imported movies. So that would both be movies, American movies that were shot at all outside of the US, but also European movies. I can tell you Americans do not watch a lot of those, but for the meager amount of international fare that comes into the US, there would be a 100% tariff. What would happen if the EU responded to that with a 100% tariff on imports of US movies? The figure for Europe as a whole is 2/3. 2/3 of movies in European cinemas come from the US. Would Europeans be willing to pay twice as much to see a movie if it's from America and pay half as much of a movie from Europe or anywhere else in the world? I don't know. This is a very culturally owned continent. This is, I think, an interesting discussion that I'll get into at the start of the Cannes Film Festival next week. What will you be working on next week?
For me, one of the big things that's really interesting me is I mean, first of all, yeah, Kieran just made a good point about the Eurovision. Very, very important
That's
cultural
just fine.
event here in
I
Europe.
can't believe I didn't mention Cannes. Who cares about Cannes? Next week is
Yeah,
Eurovision.
what is this? But no, next week.
Where are my
So
priorities?
yeah, come on, man. But so aside from Eurovision, thanks for reminding me, Kieran. I thought it was the week after. But I want to take a dive into the Weimar Triangle topic. So this is a thing that a lot of people don't understand. It's the collaboration between France, Germany, and Poland in terms of military matters. And it's sort of because of the fact that this is such a big rewiring. So we're going sort of from the Franco-German engine, which is still very important, to this Franco-German-Polish coalition that's leading European military efforts, and that's really making a big drive to become sort of the guarantors of European security in a post-America security environment. So that's something that I'm looking at putting out next week. And of course, as always, covering whatever pops up during the week, because right now, as we all know, the world is on fire and someone has to explain what the hell's going on. So,
Yeah, thanks for the reminder, Kieran, on Eurovision. I think I'll republish. Actually, I'll be on BBC next Friday. Actually, I'm not sure when this is airing. We're filming it Friday. They're probably airing it on Saturday, but it'll be like a 5-minute interview about the language politics of Eurovision, one of my favorite topics. This year's Eurovision has the most non-English songs in the history of the contest when it was allowed. So English was basically banned until 1999. That's another topic. If you want to know more, you can read the blog. But to answer Kieran's question, I'll be rooting for Finland, number one. I think I'll write another Substack actually this week about the sexiness of Eurovision '69 and how this is the most sexual contest in history. And you'll have to read next week to find out why.
some
So we'll leave it there. Little titillation there at the end. Julien, thanks so much for joining me again for
no,
another of
thank you,
our
Dave.
chats.
Thank you.
And I hope you have a great weekend.
Yes, enjoy everybody, and don't forget it's Europe Day, guys. So if you're in Brussels or if you're
Also
in
that.
your capitals, usually Europe Direct, if you have an area in your city, will have an open day, some presentations and this kind of stuff. So get some culture, have a good time, and if you're in Brussels, go to the institutions. They're all open from 10 to 4.
Yep. Cool. All right.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody.
Take care, guys.
Bye bye.